power up the force fields and grab a fancy power weapon of some description. Today we're talking about the elite shield walls of every 40k faction that has one. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking through the armies of Warhammer 40k and looking through one specific class of miniatures and how they perform on the tabletop. In this one we're talking through some melee shield infantry in Warhammer 40k, a class that really quite a lot of factions in the game have access to, though not all of them. I'd say around about half the armies in the game have something of this kind of archetype, though perhaps a notable lack of them in the Forces of Chaos for some reason. I feel like over the last few editions they've often been a class that's been kind of interesting versus some of the rest, often occupying the battlefield role where they basically stomp towards the mid-board objectives, can take a whole bunch of enemy fire and threaten to laugh it off, and hopefully score those all-important primary points, while hopefully discouraging the enemy from getting too close to them unless they want a bunch of power weapon attacks. For the ways that Storm Shields and their equivalents tend to get realised in 10th edition, pretty much every single one of these units tends to have a 4+ invulnerable save. They can be really nice but quite swingy. You can have games where your shield bearers will just disintegrate to a surprisingly low amount of enemy fire, or other games where they just bounce everything off them, and the unit seems nigh unmovable on the objective. A fair bunch of them also get a +1 to wound from their shields. That's for things that often had a 4+ invulnerable save already, say like Adeptus Custodes or Space Marine Terminators, or perhaps Space Marine characters as well as an example. And a fair bunch of them also get a -1 to wound style rule of one sort or another if it's a squad that's maybe notable for bodyguarding a character like the Sacrosancts or Lichguard. In any case, I thought we'd talk through each faction's options and also mention a few near equivalents for other armies, talk about what they do in their role in game and whether they're looking strong or not in current 40k. First up, and starting with the Space Marines, we have the Bladeguard Veteran Squad, 90 points for 3 of them, or 180 for 6. These tanky elite veterans were introduced in 9th edition along with the Indomitus box set. They used to be a pretty staple unit in 9th edition, particularly with the shield boosting them to a 2+ armor save effectively, and also being a great unit to use transhuman physiology on back then. In 10th edition though, they're maybe not quite as indomitable as they used to be. They still have a fairly healthy stat line with a toughness 4, 3 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save from that storm shield, with a special rule that can help out their durability in melee as well. You get to either choose between re-rolling 1s to hit or re-rolling 1s to save, so if they happen to be charged rather than the other way around, you can effectively have a slightly boosted invulnerable save to all intents and purposes. They get a bit of heavy bolt pistol shooting, plus the sergeant can take a fancy pistol, and in melee they strike with their mastercrafted power weapons, 4 attacks each at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2. Quite a nice well-rounded profile with a bit of AP and a bit of multi-damage, though having lowish strength they often want to combine with something that can boost that a bit. Maybe things like a lieutenant or a chaplain tend to be good mixes with them. They really get on well with new style Space Marine Oath of Moment with the +1 to wound roll, or certain divergent chapters like Blood Angels can have them hitting far harder, though they're competing against all sorts of other melee units for them. In general I think they're usable enough, maybe often jumping out of an impulsor along with a character, or maybe going for a Land Raider if you're feeling fancy for a big investment. I wouldn't say that they're quite as tanky as they used to be though back in 9th. I've given them a 7 out of 10 for power rating now, usable enough though not all that common in top competitive lists. Otherwise for Space Marines there's perhaps a couple of other options you could talk about. The other one that really fits the bill though are the Terminator Assault Squads, at 180 points for 5 of them or 360 per 10. They get the standard Terminator stat line at base, which is all very chunky, at toughness 5, 3 wounds and a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable. But if you fill them with the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield loadout, as most people tend to, you go up to a big 4 wounds. Quite a big deal for anything that's flat 3 damage trying to destroy them, as it makes things like say Forge Fiends or Exocrines far less good at killing them. As with a lot of Terminators, their damage output compared with their defense isn't quite as standout. They get 3 attacks each with Thunderhammers at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 with devastating wounds, and their special rule's a bit worse than the more standard Terminator squad, having a single battle shock when they charge in. Again, they tend to be a bit on the niche side for Space Marine armies, though can definitely work. They perhaps tend to be most commonly employed by armies like Black Templars, where Righteous Crusaders can give them some fairly nice support. Things like a 6+ Feel No Pain go down quite well, and you could have them with 10 Houses Bones with a 5+1, and maybe flexing into Anti-Psycho with those devastating wound Thunderhammers, which could give you some massive punch against things like Demon Primarchs and the like. I'm going to rate them solidly usable, but maybe not super standout. I've given them a 7 out of 10 for power here. Before we move on to the rest of the Imperium and Divergent chapters, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Magnet Baron, a USA-based supplier of magnetic bits and components for 40k kits and more, with their main selling point being high quality N52 magnets, which are perhaps a bit more reliably sourced than some other magnets out there on the internet. Magnetising tanks, vehicles and certain infantry models can be a big help in 40k. Always nice to be able to swap out turrets and weapons and things, and certainly something I do quite a lot, such as my magnetised Lehman Russes here, which have definitely been a staple from one edition to the next. Besides just selling standard magnets, they also have specific kits aimed at certain Warhammer models, such as this Questoris Knight one. This one has a bunch of 3D printed components and the specific things that you need to magnetise each portion of it, plus tutorials to follow along. Plus things like flight stand bundles, magnet applicators, drill kits to get you started, and more. I'll talk through a few more bits in their range at the end of the video, but feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and of course a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on to the rest of the Imperium, and out of the core Admech Codex they don't really have a very specific shield bearer class, probably the nearest thing being the Secutarii Hoplites in the Legends of the Horus Heresy section. These guys are some of the Titan Guard units and are armed with arc lances and shields. Their stat line's pretty similar to standard Skitarii, they're basically an upgrade sprue for that kit, but they get a 4+ invulnerable save for that shield, and then the arc lance has a bit of anti-vehicle damage, one shot at range at strength 5, AP 1, damage 1 with anti-vehicle 4+ and devastating wounds, and then 2 attacks with the same in melee, but it also gains the lance keyword. Otherwise they heroic intervene for free, and can re-roll a charge roll if there's a Titan on the battlefield, which is maybe a little bit unlikely in more standard size 40k games, but kind of fun. In general, in terms of actual power though, they're not really very well balanced versus the rest of the Admech things, particularly their Skitarii battle line troops, which in general you want more of in the army than these. I guess if you absolutely knew that your opponent was going to be bringing loads of vehicles, like you were playing Knights or Chaos Knights or something, then they might be able to do enough damage to actually be scary. I guess you might be able to get something like 8 devastating wounds across a unit between shooting and fighting, depending on other buffs. In absence of that though, they maybe just feel a little bit overly specialised and kind of need a delivery thing. Far more there for rule of cool. I've chosen to give them a 4 out of 10 here. Next up, for the Sisters of Battle, we have the Celestian Sacrosancts. 75 points for 5 of them, or 150 for 10. These girls are sort of the veteran honour guard for the Sisters. Pretty much the standard Battle Sister stat line with OC1, with a shield giving them a 4+ invulnerable save and -1 to wound when a character's leading the unit. Then they get some bolt pistols, with the Superior getting a fancy pistol. The Sister Superior can take a boosted Spear of the Faithful, and then the rest of the squad either has to choose between hallowed maces or anointed halberds, depending on whether they want to go damage 2 and lethal hits but lower strength and AP, or sustained hits 1 and damage 1 but higher strength and AP. Both of those do feel at least fairly well balanced. Unfortunately, despite getting some fairly nice datasheet upgrades, I think for the majority of the time they are just a bit expensive for what they do in the Sisters of Battle right now. I think perhaps the biggest deal with them is that they're just not tanky enough to be able to sit out in the open. Even with a -1 to wound, most things are going to be wounding them on a 4+ or better. And at 15 points per model for 1 wound infantry with a 4+ invulnerable save, it's just not really enough. I feel like if they did make a change to them, it might be nice to actually give them perhaps 2 wounds to make them absorb a bit more fire and feel a bit more robust, and maybe have that be represented as an effect of the shield in a similar way to a few of the other units out there. Otherwise, even allowing them just to get a 2+ save at base I think could be another good one. I just feel like for their battlefield role they should probably be a little bit more durable. In any case, I've given them a 6 out of 10 for power. Particularly in the face of other Sisters nerfs, I feel like they're genuinely not quite as far behind as a lot of people seem to say. There are a few good combos with them out of the detachments, and they'd be a focal unit for that recent Champions of Faith one. I would certainly say that one needs far more miracle dice to work properly. I've given them a 6 out of 10 overall. Next up, for the Adeptus Custodes, being a shield host is very much their thing, though having said that they don't really have all that many units that actually have infantry with shields on the board, the only main one being their Custodian Guard, though I guess they do have their Venatari with their bucklers. Focusing on the Custodian Guard though, and assuming that we're giving them the Presidium Shields and Sentinel Blades versus Guardian Spears, you get squads of either 4 or 5 of them at 45 points each, so this is the cheapest way that you can basically get wounds of golden armour on the board if you just want to overwhelm what the enemy can kill. The normal Custodian Guard get Toughness 6, a 2+ save, a 4+ invulnerable save and 3 wounds, so already really quite tanky, and then these guys take it to the next level by going up to 4 wounds, and again that can be really quite meaningful against things like damage 3, something that otherwise goes through a lot of Custodes really quite quickly. Unfortunately, in general, the option just isn't really considered very strong versus taking the Guardian Spears. You're giving up the big Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2 melee, which with Martial Guitar and maybe Shield Host buffs is seriously good. Instead, you drop your strength down to 6 and your damage down to 1, and it means that these guys just don't tend to be very efficient at all against big tough things, where the 2 damage in particular makes really quite a big deal. The range on the Sentinel blade gun is another downside as well, particularly as their shooting can be fairly fearsome with the option for double shooting once per game and potentially re-rolling all wound rolls as well. Having that locked down to just 12 inches is a bit of a downside. Perhaps one of their other big downsides is comparison to Custodian Wardens as well. If you just want Custodes but far more tanky, then Wardens generally tend to be the way to go. Having a -1 to wound and that 4+ feel no pain to trigger once per game is often going to make them both sturdier than these guys and far more dangerous in close combat, which is generally seen as worth the 5-point upgrade I think. Overall, for full squads of Custodian Guard with shields and swords, I'd give them a 6.5 out of 10. They just feel overshadowed by the Guardian Spears. Though a fair few people use one Presidium shield in the unit along with a Misericordia and the Vexilla, as you don't really lose too much by dropping a Sentinel Blade, and that can also be another good option to make the unit tankier if you're hit by damage 3 things, just to have that model be the first one to take damage. Moving on, and for the Astra Militarum, we have the big and chunky Bullgrin. They had a points increase recently, going up to 110 points for 3 of them, or 220 per 5. As well as that, they also did have the downside of being locked out of Lord Solar Leonta's orders as well, which I did think was another big blow to them after they went up in points quite so much. Individually though, they certainly have sturdy and very survivable stat lines. 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ invulnerable save, as generally people take the brute shield, but then the combination of a 6+ feel no pain and a -1 damage from their Wall of Muscle special rule basically means that really quite a lot of damage just evaporates between that and the invulnerable save. And weirdly enough, quite a lot of spammed low AP damage one-shots can often be the thing that does as much damage to them as big anti-tank weapons. Then in melee, people generally tend to use the Bullgrin Maul over the Grenadier Gauntlet as it's balanced right now. The Mauls give you 4 attacks at Strength 7, AP 1 and Damage 2, a profile that maybe doesn't punch up too great against the toughest stuff with the highest saves, but has enough volume and enough strength to do a fair bit of attrition to most else in the game. Despite the points hikes and Leonta's nerf, I still say they're usable enough if you do want to make them work and put them on the table. Guard don't have a crazy amount of melee, and it may be often forced to either these guys or Rough Riders to take down stuff in close combat, and they can be alright for something tough to hold up a mid-board objective. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here, and I would have rated them a bit higher than this before the Lord Solar Leonta's nerf. Being able to get that move for extra charge distance was quite a big one. Next up, for the Imperial Agents, we have the Subductor Squad. I'd say for the Imperial Agents, as they go, it's probably one of their more competitive units, with a few factions tempted enough to ally them in when they were all 85 points. Now they're 85 points within the faction, or 100 points if allied. Games Workshop decided to nerf them. These are the Adeptus Arbites with the Riot Shields. In melee, they strike with Shock Mauls for 2 attacks at Strength 4, AP 1, Damage 1, and can fight on death on a 4+, though damage output isn't really their big thing. They'll only really be able to do a bit of attrition to some lighter infantry, and maybe down the odd Space Marine or 2 if they're lucky. The standout thing for 85 points though is their durability. They get a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable each, and for a points cost that's just over half the amount of a Celestian Sacrosanct for example. And in general it does tip them from being a unit that most enemies aren't going to be able to wipe out in a single turn of shooting or fighting, just due to having an okay save and a whole load of invulnerables for an 8.5 point model. On top of that, they've also got a Nuncio Aquila, which seems quite good for their intended role, skirmishing over the mid-board objectives, which could allow them to throw out a Battle Shock in the command phase, potentially stopping an enemy from contesting an objective against them, or stopping the enemy scoring if they happen to fail. Definitely not reliable, but a nice little bonus. In general, the Imperial Agents aren't exactly having the best time of it, to put it mildly, but these guys are pretty strong I think. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here, and several other factions were certainly finding them interesting enough to play as allies before Games Workshop increased the points cost. Next up, for the Dark Angels, we've got the rather indomitable Deathwing Knights, 250 points per 5 models now, and they basically give you an Assault Terminator squad turned up to 11. They get the 4 wounds similar to the Assault Terminators, but also get their Inner Circle rule, which gives them a big -1 damage, and that just makes a bunch of weapons even less effective against them. Damage 2 going down to damage 1 is a really big deal. That means they actually need to be hit by a damage 5 attack before you actually slay one in a single shot, which doesn't happen all that often. They've even got a Watcher in the Dark for a once per game 4+ save against mortal wounds, which again is kind of great as that would otherwise be one of the best ways to kill them. In close combat they fight either with Maces of Absolution or power weapons, both of which are really quite viable. The Maces get fewer attacks but the anti-monster and vehicle keyword, which makes them a fair bit more general purpose, though the power weapons can be quite nice with buffs, say from a chaplain in the unit, or maybe a detachment rule giving them lance or +1 to wound in some way. The Knightmaster gets a boosted version, often going for the great weapon flair of the Unforgiven type thing with the devastating wounds. Despite the points increase, they still seem to be one of the power units for the Dark Angels. Lots of damage and lots of defense, and are strong enough to be run solo without any support if you want to. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 for power rating here. For the Space Wolves, we have the Savage Wulfen, 95 points for 5 of them, or 190 for 10. These guys were treated really quite differently in 10th edition versus 9th than before. Nowhere near as crazy big damage that they can get with their Thunder Hammers. Now the Wulfen Hammers just strike at Strength 6, AP 1, Damage 2, but the unit's kind of cheap as well at essentially 19 points per model. And for that cost they're also at least somewhat tanky as well. 2 wounds at Toughness 5 with a 4+ invulnerable from their Storm Shields. They also have a 6+ Feel No Pain. In general they're quite a nice skirmish unit, moving 8 inches, a big volume of attacks for just 5 of them for that points cost, particularly with the damage 2, meaning that they'll wreck most of their equivalent 2 wound infantry units with ease and can take any detachment buffs really quite well. They can fight in death too, which means that some things really don't want to try and kill them in close combat. The big downside for them is that they're OC0 though, and that turns what would be a pretty great objective skirmishing unit into one that's maybe a fair bit more limited in what you can do with them. Basically good for some damage defense and being expendable, but just a bit annoying that they can't charge onto an objective, wipe something out, and then be something that the opponent actually has to deal with if they want to take it back. Or if they're not dealt with, then they won't be scoring you any points on that primary. Even despite that though, I feel like they're strong enough to have at least some in the army as a big damage and defensive style unit that moves quite fast and hits fairly hard. I've chosen to give them a 7.5 out of 10 here. Otherwise for Space Marines in the Divergent chapters, there's quite a few things that could fit the bill. They'll either feel kind of similar to the generic ones or might not always be run with shields. I guess from the core codex there's the Space Marine Vanguard veterans that feel perhaps in a bit of a different style given that they get jump packs, but you can field them with shields plus their relic weapons, so you get a fairly sturdy jump infantry squad with a bunch of strength 5 damage 1 attacks. Games Workshop does seem to be discouraging them a bit though, as they got a points increase recently. I think potentially just literally for Blood Angels players and maybe trying to encourage them into things like Death Company or Sanguinary Guard. In general though, for the majority of the other chapters now, I feel like they're a bit underpowered with their damage output being what it is. Beyond them and the generic options, the Blood Angels elites don't fight with swords and shields or anything like that. They can certainly make Bladeguard or the Assault Terminators hit hard in melee. Space Wolves have a couple of other interesting options. Their Wolf Guard can both take shields both for the Power Armoured and the Terminator versions. 85 points for the on-foot Wolf Guard I think is at least fairly interesting. They get the sort of consolidated relic weapon sort of profile with 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 1, damage 1, and a +1 to hit if characters are about, plus a 4+ invulnerable save. Maybe a nice enough blend of sturdy and a little bit more hard hitting than some things out there. Definitely competing with a whole bunch of other Space Marine units in that kind of price tag though. Otherwise, the Wolfguard Terminators can mix and match the Assault Terminator and the generic Terminator datasheet loadouts. And that means that you could do interesting things like have a majority of Assault Terminators plus the Cyclone Missile Launcher from the more regular squad, though they do have a bit of a premium in the points cost for that over the regular Codex version. And I guess if we're going for all melee squads with shields, then the Thunderwolves can and do take them as well. Shields definitely seem to be a Space Wolf thing. Otherwise, the Deathwatch also have a couple of units that can use them quite well. Similarly to the Wolfguard Terminators, they've got the Deathwatch Terminator squad, and you can say mix 2 Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators with 3 Cyclone Missile Launcher ones, and that just makes you a fairly scary and well-rounded squad. Far more range damage than a normal unit, and a bit tankier as well, given that a couple of them will have 4 wounds. As it goes, that just seems head and shoulders over most of the other chapters' Terminator datasheets for 180 points. And otherwise, if you wanted to, you could equip the Deathwatch veterans with storm shields and melee weapons and things, though in general it just doesn't really make sense to versus taking their heavy thunderhammers and the bigger shooting weapons like frag cannons or Infernus heavy bolters. Otherwise, there's not quite so much. The Black Templars can do Assault Terminators pretty well with Anti-Psyker and the Tenhouse's Bones for the 5+ Feel No Pain. Grey Knights have plenty of elite infantry, lots of which are fairly tanky and fight in melee, though they don't really do a shield version, and I thought the Imperial Fists were worth a quick shout out perhaps, just because of having some pretty fun breachery looking squads for the Horus Heresy. I feel like if they ever did a power armoured Imperial Fist unit for Warhammer 40k, getting one with some breaching shields would be rather cool. Lastly for the Imperial Knights don't really do shield infantry. Though given that all they do is basically medium-sized or Titanic walkers, it seemed remiss not to mention the Knight Lancer, basically the only Imperial Knight class with a massive shield, and their Imperial Armour data sheet can also be fielded for Chaos as well. For the Imperial Knights, the Lancer is a force to be reckoned with, moving 14 inches with 25 wounds and a flat 4+ invulnerable save that you also get in melee is a lot sturdier than the average big knight. plus get a 6+ feel no pain at the moment, plus the inbuilt nightly rerolls. He has a small shooting attack with some nearby shock lance shot to thin down a nearby enemy infantry unit, and then strikes home in melee with the same sort of melee as a Knight Gallant has. 5 attacks at strength 20, AP 3 and damage 8 with the lance keyword for this one, so +1 to wound. A sweep mode that's good against Terminators, and he also gets a 0 CP tank shock as well, which would help out for a few more mortal wounds, in particular with the combination of being able to smash through ruined walls now. It's kind of hard to be out of charge range for this guy, and he does feel like the sort of unit that can just charge into the heart of the enemy army and then tank a whole bunch of damage while your army moves up behind. Certainly one of the stronger Imperial Knights currently. I've given him an 8.5 out of 10 here. Otherwise, as mentioned, you can also field him for Chaos as well. He's very slightly cheaper at 420 points, swaps out the big damage rerolls and the feel no pain for battle shock things and a few different stratagems. He can also buff nearby war dogs with the assault keyword, as opposed to the advance and charge that the Imperials can get. I'd say due to lacking the feel no pain and the damage rerolls, he's not quite as strong as his Imperial counterparts, as often seems to be the case for Titanic Knights in the Chaos Knight army these days, but he's still one of the Titanic variants that gets more play than most, and I've given him an 8 out of 10 there. Still one of the Titanic Knights that breaks through a little bit more than some of the counterparts, even if a whole load of Chaos Knight lists still run nothing but War Dogs. Otherwise, for the Forces of Chaos, it does feel kind of notable just how much this shield unit kind of archetype is missing from their armies. There isn't a melee unit bearing shields for anything from Core Codex Chaos Marines, Death Guard Thousand Suns or World Eaters, or even Chaos Demons as well, which is if anything kind of surprising as almost being a bit of a fantasy faction in space. I feel like it's definitely the sort of thing that would have a bit of draw to it, maybe Thousand Suns having some core rubrics with shields and spears or something. I feel like you could do Death Guard with breacher shields and guns or something and that would go down pretty well, and definitely getting creative with other things as well. I guess maybe Games Workshop's trying to keep the Chaos armies with a bit more of an aggressive archetype as opposed to being on the defensive like a bunch of Imperial elites seem to be, but maybe feels like a bit of a gap in their range. It's not that they don't have unit archetypes that fill a similar sort of battlefield role. Pretty much all the Terminators can do well for slow tanky melee elites, though I feel like if we just go through all of them then we're going for more sort of ranking every Terminator in the game as opposed to just shield bearer type things, so I'll leave them for this video. Getting into Xenos armies, and we do have a few more though. For the Aeldari, we've got the Wraith Blades, the chunky close combat Wraith Guard variant with toughness 7, 3 wounds and a 2+ save, and getting a 4+ invulnerable save if you take them with the Ghost Axe and Force Shield, which most people certainly seem to, and the better strength and the damage 2 on the Ghost Axe certainly don't hurt with that either. On their defensive profile they're certainly pretty intimidating, particularly for the 32 points or so that the smaller squad costs now, and could be made a bit more so with things like a Farseer giving them -1 to wound. If you're taking some of them as well, it's probably worth taking a Spirit Seer along. They can hit on a 3+ and then also get lethal hits and have a restored bodyguard in each command phase. So maybe it is a bit more tempting to take them in a big 10-man squad, which will be higher points per model if you do so, just to get the most out of that buffs, and by that point you're making a kind of massive commitment to the unit. For a while now they do seem to have been a bit overshadowed in terms of Aeldari army list building. I haven't seen too many of them running around in tournament lists. I've chosen to give them a 6.5 out of 10 here, though I feel like maybe I could have been persuaded to be a bit more generous to them. Next up, we've got the Lich Guard of the Necrons. They're 85 points per 5 of them, or 170 per 10. The Elite Guard to the Nobles of the Dynasty, and certainly made an impact early in 10th edition with their nigh unkillable units that had just reanimate after you destroyed half of it, particularly when backed up by a Technomancer. Those days are a fair bit past though, and now they have a fairly different unit role. They're fairly cheap at 17 points per model, are almost always running with the Dispersion Shield and Hyperphase Sword, and 2 wounds at toughness 5 with a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. They're also -1 to wound as well, while they're protecting an enemy noble and the strength of the attack is greater than the toughness. I feel like between all that and after the multiple waves of points revisions that Necrons have had, they do feel like quite a usable unit. Maybe the single most obvious thing to do with them would be to run them with Imitet the Stormlord if you want him in an army list. He works quite well with them as he can rustle up some command points for the rest of your army, and then they can give him a durable guard to stomp towards the midboard and fight over the midboard objectives with, and get a bit of value out of his damage profile and special rules. They can be nice in a few of the detachments as well, particularly the Obeisance Phalanx, but they can be nice enough in Awakened Dynasty. I feel like they'd be nice enough with Imatech and the new Star Shatter one, potentially getting some big damage buffs on the midboard when they need it. I've chosen to give them a 7.5 out of 10 here. Finally, for a couple that maybe stretch the definition a little bit, I kind of felt like the Tyrant Guard at least deserved a honourable mention for the Tyranids, basically fighting as pretty much big living shields for a hive tyrants, even if they're not really a melee unit fighting with a shield as such. They're 80 points per 3 of them, having gone down a bit in the last balance update, are genuinely very tanky for the cost now, around 27 points or so for 4 wounds at toughness 8 with a 3+ save, and certainly make a Hive Tyrant from being a big easy target to focus down into something that's going to take a lot more effort, and you're going to have to smash through 3 very chunky guys before you can even get to the Hive Tyrant's profile. They don't exactly have the biggest damage output, and you can choose between a flurry of attacks at damage 1, some twin linked ones with strength 5 and damage 2, or some less accurate ones with strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 and twin links. I feel like between those there are genuine trade-offs as to what sort of units they might like to target. There could be a big interesting Synapse unit for the Synaptic Nexus potentially, or be quite an interesting unit to revive models for the Assimilation Swarm. They perhaps feel nice enough if wanting to run the Swarm Lord as well, maybe allowing him to operate a bit close towards the midfield if he wants to, and debuff those enemy command points without having to worry about being shot down quite so early. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. Lots of people prefer to run the Hive Tyrants without them. I think they do have some fairly impressive defensive stats for the cost. Finally, and again taking one that's stretching the definition a bit, the Tau certainly don't have any melee shield elites, at least not that you field en masse unlike Commander Farsight I suppose, but the Sunforged suits are kind of weirdly close to the criteria for a short-range crisis suit. They're the ones that get the shield generator and can take a shield drone for an extra wound, though in reality they kind of operate pretty differently, just being regular crisis suits with the big damage rerolls against monsters and vehicles, and more tend to be close-range drop special weapons if you want them. They're definitely solid enough into their preferred targets, and can work quite well with some commander enhancements and Commander Farsight potentially. They really didn't like that change to the Retaliation Cadre though, the one that stops them from dropping super close to the enemy, so they can no longer drop within fusion range or get the second part of the Retaliation buff. I feel like that maybe took the edge off them a little bit in the strongest place to run them. I've ranked them a 7.5 out of 10 here. Otherwise though, out of the 4 remaining Xenos factions, there aren't quite so many shield lines of infantry. The Drukhari tend to be faster and flightier. I guess the slowest and tankiest of their troops for infantry tend to be the Grotesques, so they're more soaking damage with a bunch of durability rather than force shields. The Leagues of Votan probably have their closest thing in the Einhir Hearthguard, again more of a Terminator equivalent than anything else, though I guess their Einhir Champion sports a rather fun shield if you want them. The Genestealer Court's perhaps nearest thing might be tanky Aberrants, not quite as tough as they were before the Codex came out, but still able to take some punches and are pretty competitive in Biosanctic Broodsurge in particular. And Orcs in general don't really seem to go for so many shields as much in Warhammer 40k. They do have some chunky units between just lots of boys with a fair bit of durability, or maybe Meganobs or Squighogs perhaps. It's kind of interesting to think of the unit that Games Workshop might come out with though, if they did decide to apply the same archetype to some of these factions. I feel like some sort of Orc Nob variant with some tanky scrap shields will look very cool indeed, or maybe you could do something of that sort of nature for a Beast Snagger Nob squad. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know what you make of the shield lines of Warhammer 40k, which of these units have you been using in game or not, and why. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments. Finally though, I'll just cycle back to the Magnet Baron, the sponsor of this video, and as mentioned has some high quality magnets for sale based in the USA. They tend to be more efficient actually shipped internally rather than overseas shipping, though maybe could make sense if you were going for a particularly big order. In any case, in addition to the things that I talked about earlier, they've also got a magnetizing starter bundle. If you're a bit unsure how to get into it, this one's got a pin vise with some drill bits, some magnet applicators, some good super glue that works for them, and a variety of things to start with. Maybe fairly handy to have all of that together in a one-stop shop. The applicator tools are quite popular in themselves, being super glue resistant to allow you to apply magnets more easily and not be having to risk your fingers there. As mentioned, for their more mainline offerings, they've got plenty of magnetic kits, including the Questoris Knight one. Kind of fun to see all the stage-by-stage instructions of those. They've got quite nice tutorials for them on the website. And have plenty of other similar kits, maybe of slightly more basic levels for things like Monolith, Knight Armigers and War Dogs, the Archaeopter for the Admech or the Rogel Dawn Battle Tank, and they've been adding a few more recently. Otherwise, for fun stuff, they've got some flush fit magnets for bases, which are 2.2mm high, aimed to be the same size as Games Workshop bases if you want something that can fit nice and flush for magnetic storage systems. And otherwise, their flight stands are fairly popular as well, often being a big criticism of Games Workshop miniatures. I've generally done a few DIY ones for some of my armies, but something a bit more purpose built doesn't hurt as well. I feel like it looks quite good on the Grav tank and this Venatari Custodian here. In any case, a big thanks to them for sponsoring the video with all of their magnetic contraptions. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. In any case, I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to help support the channel and keep the videos coming, feel free to check out the Patreon page or the 40k discount links in the video description. A big thank you to anyone using those, but otherwise a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.